to say one good thing about lockdown, because it's given us a turnout that we've got today, which you may not normally have. And thanks to Zoom, so we're able to welcome members of the other league groups as well. Anyway, it gives me especially great pleasure to welcome Judy, who happens to be my cousin, if you didn't know that. And she's agreed to give us a talk about the other side of her family, with the beguiling title, My Austro-Hungarian Forebears, with the tales of Spanish gold, guinea pigs, and an English colonel.
So, My Austro-Hungarian Forebears, tales of Spanish gold, guinea pigs, and an English colonel. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. When you explore your family history, you never know what you will find. I have been so fortunate as to find an extraordinary treasure trove of fascinating forebears. This has not been through careful genealogical research, but through chance encounters, amazing coincidences, and most enjoyably, through finding other living descendants, some of whom are on this call today, all of whom proved to be great people to get to know. When I was little, I thought I was part of a very small family. Gradually, that family has grown outwards in the most delightful of ways. Now I have a treasure trove of stories, some of which I hope to delight you with today. There are so many more, but this is a taster. In this first part, we will start with a family photo, revisit the family schloss, and take in the Paris Commune. So fasten your seatbelt and please join me for the ride. Let me start with this family photo. Before I introduce you to these characters, can I draw your attention to the bottom right-hand corner, where it is written, Atelier, Pietzner, Wien, 1895. It's very faint, so I've typed it up for you, as you may not be able to read it. So, Atelier Karl Pietzner was very famous in his own day. He was a celebrated photographer at the time, owning studios in a number of cities, having a top clientele, including those of you who are sharp-eyed might have noticed Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, and monarch of the states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which are included in my talk. He was the emperor from 1848 until his death in 1916, a pretty long stint, just before the fall of his empire in 1917. So these are Google's examples of Pietzner's work. And those of you who are sharp-eyed might have noticed there's quite a lot of the emperor there. But let's go back to my family photo. I was given this in 2008, 112 years after it was produced. And I'm going to tell you stories of many of the characters in it. In the middle are my grandfather, Guido Ellbogen, and my great-grandfather, Guido Ellbogen, and my great-grandmother, Rosalie, also called Ali and Grigri. Antoinette is my great-aunt, who married Wilhelm von Adler, and Steffi is their first child. But my family had lost contact with the von Adlers as a result of the Second World War, and I knew nothing about them other than as names in a family tree that my father had produced. Heinrich is the second surviving child of Guido and Ali. Henry apparently was passionate about astronomy and hunting and was one of the best rifles in Austria. He had competed with rifles in the Olympic Games in Stockholm in 1912, but he was taken prisoner by the Russians in the First World War and freed long after it in 1920. He came home ill and he died in 1927. I believe that this is my great-grandmother, Frederica Ellbogen. And finally, we have my grandmother, Jenny. I think my family photo is really rather remarkable for the time it was produced, 1895. I showed it once to a photographic historian, and he was quite amazed. I would love to know how it was done. It could have been artwork by the atelier, but as there seem not to be any other examples of this kind from the studio, or others that I could find, I wonder whether one of my family was the artist who put the pictures together. I suspect I will never know for sure, though if you follow my talk carefully, you may gather who I think it could be. So starting with myself, I was born in Wolverhampton in 1950 and brought up in Pontefract near Leeds. I knew we had an aunt on my mother's side and one on my father's side, but we only saw them occasionally. And so I had the impression that I had just a little family, just my brothers and my brother and sister, my parents, my brother and sister. Gradually, as I got older, I met a few relatives in Israel and other places, but still quite a small circle of people. So my father told me growing up that my great-grandfather Guido had bought a grand country estate, Schloss Thalheim, in 1881 with over 100 acres of land in the middle of Austria near St. Pölten, an hour west of Vienna. It was sold in distress to the Nazis in 1938 after 57 years in the family. Jenny and her husband Friedrich Wolominski fled to London along with my father. After the war, Jenny fought to get it back, and much to the family's surprise, she succeeded. She died in 1957. We visited Schloss Thalheim in 1960 when it was in a dilapidated state, and it was returned to the ownership of my family. It was then sold, as neither my father nor his three sisters wanted to live in rural Austria. So that picture is a picture of me actually at Thalheim when I was 10 years old. So, my father was very interested in producing family trees, but all that data seemed very dry and irrelevant to me. However, when in 1990, my partner Bob and I planned to visit Prague for a weekend, just after the Velvet Revolution, I asked my father if it might be possible that we have any relatives there. No, he said, that's very unlikely. However, if you can take a look in a telephone directory and see if there are any people listed with our name but starting with a V rather than a W, well, they would probably be related. As it was only shortly after the fall of communism, it was not that easy to find accommodation. Unfortunately, through a connection in my work, accommodation was arranged for us by a Czech couple. They came to see us in our hotel to make sure that everything was okay. Did we need any help, they asked. Well, I said, I would love to look at a telephone directory to see if anyone has our name, because they might be related. I'm just going to... Oh, they replied, you don't need to do that. Our good friend has your name. And that is how we came to know the Czech Wolominskis, who proved all to be lovely, lovely people and were my fourth cousins. However, telling you about them and our explorations in Czechoslovakia would be a very different talk. Anyway, we visited them several times, driving across Europe to get there. Returning from one of our trips to Czechoslovakia in 1998, we decided to come back via Austria rather than Germany. So we thought, why not see if we can find Schloss Thalheim? But we couldn't find it on our Austria map, even though I knew pretty well where it should be, about an hour's journey west from Vienna. Thalheim is only a small village, and it wasn't on the map. However, Bob, who has very sharp eyes, found it at the bottom of a Czech map. So clearly, we had to go. As we were getting near, and it was getting afternoon, and the children were small and we hadn't yet found any accommodation for the night, I was starting to worry that if we found the place, it would be all locked up, and all I could do was point it out. So was it worth this wild goose chase? Instead, we found the gates open, and here I am with my daughters, contemplating whether to go in. Bob hung back. Not only was he the photographer for this recording, of this historic moment, but also there were two large dogs. But I went in to open what turned out to be a new chapter in our lives, and it turned out that our timing was truly amazing. We found a young couple standing in the grounds, the rentmeisters, as we called them, Jörg and Nora. It turns out that they had just bought it and were talking to a builder about the work that needed doing. They weren't living there yet, as it had no electricity and no running water. And they told us if we had come a day earlier or later, even an hour earlier or later, they wouldn't have been there. Schloss Talheim had been standing empty for the intervening 38 years since I had last seen it, and somehow we managed to turn up at absolutely the right time. As you can see, it is a very large place. The rentmeisters, Jörg and Nora, were very friendly after they got over the initial suspicion, and we spent a couple of hours being shown around. They invited us to come for a proper visit in a couple of years, by which time they hoped to have the place all fixed up. I have to say that we were a little sceptical, as clearly the job was so enormous, but hopefully we didn't show it. This newer building on the left is called the White House. It was built by Guido, I think for Antoinette and her family. The older building is apparently from 1600. And this is the White House staircase.
Beautiful.
And I just had to show you on the bottom of this grand staircase, a little pixie was adorning it when we visited the first time. True to their words, we were welcomed back to Talheim 2 years later. We returned with my father, who you can see here, looking at a display of the different places called Talheim, all dotted around. My father was then 92 years young, and as you can see, still pretty game.
Good heavens.
But probably you can also see that the place was still in need of a lot of work. Only the White House was livable in. All of the grand things which had been inside had gone, probably cleared out by the Russians who had taken it from the Nazis during the war and used it as hospital and barracks. However, in the room that Bob and I stayed in the White House, there was a built-in cupboard which remained. And here it is. My father took one look at it and said, "Those doors, they were painted by your grandmother, Jenny."
Good Lord.
That was a delightful coincidence.
How amazing.
Here it is, slightly more up in detail.
Fantastic.
The new owners, the rentmeisters, had set up one room as an exhibition area. On the wall was a letter that I wrote to them shortly after our initial visit, telling them everything about Talheim that my father could remember. We had a lovely time. Here's my elder daughter Emma on horseback, my younger daughter starting to get into the farming life, and they both had fun with the haystacks. We had a lovely time. And we even had Shabbat at Talheim, which was great. We also visited a nearby war memorial. My father wanted to see if his cousin Hans Adler, who was killed in the First World War, was listed there, as apparently his name had been removed by the Nazis after 1938. We were pleased to see that it had been returned. Well, our trip in 2000 was fascinating, and we returned again to visit a few years later. But in 2007, the rentmeisters decided that Talheim was too big a project for them, and they sold the Schloss to the Russians, who wanted to convert it into a hotel. Ironically, I think it's gone round in circles, having been Russian during the war, and now it's a posh Russian hotel. So that seemed like the end of our connection with Schloss Talheim. My father died in 2005, So truly it was the end of an era. But then, a year later, in 2008, out of the blue, I received a package containing a booklet in French about Schloss Talheim. It turns out I have French cousins through the de Adlers. And here is a letter that I received from Marie-Ange Adler, who is actually on this call. And she wrote in beautiful English. I imagine you can't read it on the screen, so I'll read it for you. Dear Mrs. Wolominski, although I have never had any opportunity to meet you, it happens that our families are related. We are both offspring of Guido and Rosalie Elbogen. Within the last year, some cousins and I did some investigation on our common origin, the Elbogen, and in our case, the Adler. We thought that the resulting booklet may be of some interest to you and decided to send you a copy. We hope that the French language will not deter you from reading it. We got some information concerning the letter which you wrote 10 years ago to the present owners of Talheim. If you ever happen to visit Paris, I will be happy to meet you. Conversely, sometimes I come to London and could visit you then. Sincerely yours, Marie-Ange Adler. How amazing to receive this booklet with a friendly letter telling me about my French cousins. My cousin Charlotte, who was born in 1927, was particularly excited. She had many memories of happy summers in Talheim, and of course, she knew her de Adler cousins. So, with my sister Eva and her daughter Lucy, we visited them in France and had a wonderful family reunion. It was particularly special for my elderly cousin Charlotte, who knew these cousins before the war. For me, they had only been names on a family tree which my father had written. So these are my French cousins, with my first cousin Charlotte and Lucy at the front. And here's the whole family gathering. How happy we were. The reunion was very timely, as since then, many of the people on the photo are no longer with us. After our visit, my newly found French cousins sent me a second booklet based on a letter written in French in 1901 by Rosalie, my great-grandmother, to her daughter, my great-aunt, Antoinette's children. It turned out to be, these are Antoinette's children. It turned out to be a fascinating letter, and with the help of Google, I translated it into English. It is charming, emotion-filled, and a fascinating letter, and I want to read you a few excerpts from it. So, fasten your seatbelts. We're heading for the Paris Commune. Think about the depiction in Les Miserables. The letter starts 31st of December 1901. To my dear grandchildren, Steffi, Hans, Rudy, Susie and Eddie de Adler, I dedicate these pages. I promised myself, as soon as the terrible misfortune which makes them half orphans struck us, to leave them an image as faithful as possible, and that my memory could provide them of their dear, good and beautiful mum as a child and a young girl, and from the little that I knew of her as a woman. Your poor father, my dears, has the same plan on his side, but, broken by pain, nervous as he has become, I fear he never has the courage, as he has reproduced his sweet figure, to leave in you his features, many aspects as possible. Similarly admitting that he keeps his word, the more you know this adorable being, the more you will like him. And if, as I believe, we can rejoice in the sky where 20 went, she will be happy with the love that you will have kept or awakened in her heart. I did not want to see the end of this bad year which removed your mother without writing at least these few lines to you. To understand it well, to grasp fully what has been for us, it seems to me I must tell you in a few words how your grandfather and I got to know each other and to love each other. And I said once, and maintain it, Antoinette was a child who should be born to us, young, happy, carefree, and in love as we were. Her whole nature happy and spreading peace and joy around her, derived from our happy union, of which no concern from the outside had yet been able to disturb the harmony. Your paternal grandfather, Siegfried Adler, was a friend of my father, Anton Schwabacher. In August 1868, being in Paris, he took a distant relative of ours to recommend him to my father. It was your grandfather, Guido Ellbogen, then 20 years old. Only you who knew us when we were old and shattered by your death of your poor mother, can you imagine Grandpa, young, cheerful, active, exuberant, dancing breathlessly, making a noise like four, and having in his good black eyes this flame of malice and gaiety, which death has extinguished in 20. Can you imagine Grandma Ali? Thin and light, with pink and white cheeks, her green eyes full of fire, her brown hair with copper reflections, pretty, they say, cheerful and young for sure. I was 15 and was far too childish to even dream of getting married. Guido likewise, though anxious at the price of the great sacrifices by his parents with few fortunes had made for his career, and wanted to make it a very beautiful and very honest career, which makes it more difficult and longer, and perhaps less fortunate. He was lucky to have his chance. He made his position first in the house that my father ran in Paris, Oppenheim, Alberti. He deserved favour continued after my father's death in 1868. This death was a signal for many who owed him everything to neglect us. But others, your grandfather on the front line, returned what they owed him in fidelity and devotion. Despite the age difference, he became my mother's confidant and counsellor. He came more and more to the house, and one day I realised that I loved him. Fortunately, at that time, the Baron de Springer hired him as the representative of his Viennese house in Paris, the Anglo-Austrian Bank, with such salaries and bonuses that he could think about reckless management. He was just waiting for that. He wanted to be able to say later that his position had not been given to him because he had married me. On March 17, the same day when he signed his contract with Springer, he asked and easily got my hand. I attended many engagements for love, since, as one of my friends laughed, love marriage is hereditary in our family. But I've never seen such euphoria, such completely cloudless happiness. Only the death of my father, who would have been so happy to see this union, saddened the horizon. On 8th of June 1870, Guido, 24 years old, and me, 19 years old, we concluded this bond which today, after almost 32 years, subsists in its first integrity, making some smile and touching others. Then came the horrible war of 1870. We left for a trip of a few weeks in August to Austria, and then to Brussels, always loving and always happy and full of tenderness. At the thought of the little one being given, who was about to give the last sanction to our love and whom we were waiting for at the end of March 1871. I settled in Brussels in a hotel crowded with refugees, with my mother, my sisters, Grandpa had work to do in London, which explains our departure to Brussels to be closer to each other. We had first thought of not leaving each other, but the fear of risking the precious little existence determined us to this great sacrifice. Not only were we separated all week, but by one of the harshest winters I can remember. Every week, Grandpa travelled 2 nights to spend 24 hours with me and to be back in business on Monday morning. Often the storm or the fog made the journey difficult or dangerous, but nothing stopped the lover. Finally came the armistice peace and we returned to Paris at the beginning of March, and then broke out the insurrection of the Commune 22, which was one of those atrocious days that never seemed to end. Paris was divided. On the one hand, the people of the Commune, socialists, anarchists, mad as a result of the privations of the siege, enraged and by stupidity having weapons as a result of the lack of courage of the chiefs, especially Jules Favre at the head. When the peace was signed at Versailles, he left the army to disarm and called for the rifles and the cannons of the brave National Guard. On the other side were the bourgeois and the supporters of order. We were to have dinner that evening at my mother's house in France. In France, we always continued to dance in the middle of a riot, and none of us found it unusual to have dinner with the family. The communes had already shot 2 generals 4 days before in Montmartre, and the partisans of the order had announced that 22nd of March, a peaceful demonstration. We had to advance to Place Vendôme, where was the Communard General Staff, demonstrating peacefully in imposing masses without arms and withdraw quietly. My brother-in-law and several friends were there. To fully understand the situation, you must know that I lived 10 minutes from the boulevard. My sister and our friends who were to have dinner with my mother, all on the same side at various distances. Place Vendôme by Rue de la Paix intersects that of Rue de la Quatre Septembre. It is opposite this corner where the demonstration was to pass. Suddenly my maid rushes in. "Madame, we massacre everything. We shot at the demonstration. Streams of blood flow down Rue de la Paix and Rue de Quatre Septembre at the boulevard." I grab a hat and am fleeing in the streets of Paris. I run to the boulevard, but the crowd is huge. A peacekeeper said to me, "Madame, in your state, do not go into the crowd." "But sir, my man." "What? Is your husband in the demonstration?" "No, but you will kill everyone on Rue de Quatre Septembre, and there is his office." "Ah, we don't kill anything anymore," he said to me. "There were 1 or 2 discharges on the demonstration, and there are some dead and some wounded. Go home, it's the safest way to find your man." I followed his advice. I climbed to my house, hoping against hope that he is there. I find my sister outside without news of her man, with her 6-week-old baby, Delphine. Madame Mandel arrives to say that 2 deaths have been reported on her street. It is already 6 o'clock, and we're going to start all over again, when thankfully we see Guido and Armand thread the alley that leads to Mom's. You understand our situation. We were forced to dine with Mum, having nothing with us. I suddenly notice that I'm in slippers and a robe, so Grandpa takes me home to change my toilette. I'm so tired. Shortly after dinner, we return to our homes. To get to our place, we have to cross Rue d'Amsterdam, where we live. In Place Clichy, at the top of the street, there are insurgents with cannons pointed at Saint-Lazare station. At the bottom of the street, which is occupied by the battalions of the order, the cannons are pointed at Place Clichy. We see above and below the bivouac lights, and we, ignorant and frightened women, we believe we see the wicks lit and we expect to see the streets swept by projectiles. I come home broken, and after a few poor hours' sleep interrupted by calls from the night patrols, I wake up completely. Soon there is no longer any doubt. A doctor and a nurse are needed. We bring them trembling at the fear, at the expense of the patrols of the different parties which meet, however, with the charitable idea of letting through the aid which I need. More courageous, my mother arrives. What a night. We dare not light a candle. We dare not light. A candle flickers, the door trembles, and the doctor trembles at the idea of returning and envies a nurse who will remain. In his terror, he put his hat, adorned with a Geneva cross, upside down, which makes me want to laugh despite myself. We hear calls. It is dismal, and suddenly, in the midst of these sorrows, the one who was joy, triumphant gaiety, beauty and strength, who died in the bright sun of a beautiful June day, in full bliss, made her miserable appearance in this world. Where is my fairy tale princess? I hold in my arms a big, thin, red baby with prominent cheekbones, a swollen mouth, hairy to the eyes, with a lock of flat black hair. And I tell him the sentence that made us laugh so often later. My poor little monkey, you are very ugly, but I love you all the same. I always intended to feed my darling myself. Guido didn't want me to, but among the 20 or more or less good reasons that the doctor put forward, one took precedence over all the others and was irrefutable. After the war, the nurses were nowhere to be found, and they were bad. So we experienced during a state of things which resembled a siege, amidst the uncertainties of the future, the sweetest weeks of our happiness, completed by our dear child. When you could hear the cannons of the forts thundering in the distance, when sometimes a shell passed whistling on the outskirts of the city, what unforgettable hours, either that the young father cradles a child, or that he watched me feed her, or that leaning over its cradle we noticed progress or embellishments that only existed in our loving looks. So I think this might be a good point at which to take a break. Let's turn to the quiet orderliness of bank work. You will recall that Baron de Springer hired my great-grandfather Guido Ellbogen as the representative of his Viennese bank, his Viennese branch in Paris of the Anglo-Austrian Bank, with such salaries and bonuses that he could think about reckless management. In his bank, Guido was doing linguistic wonders, speaking German and French and English. Now I will tell you the story about how he boasted he would learn Spanish in a few weeks. Okay, fasten your seatbelts again. We're off for that Spanish gold that I put in the title of this talk. The story is told that Baron de Springer asked Guido if he spoke Spanish. He replied, no, but if you need me to, then I will be able to in 3 weeks. He did so, and shortly afterwards was sent to Spain with the mission of recovering from the Spanish government the considerable debt owed to France. It was at the time of the Civil War, with Spanish presidents succeeding one another in quick succession. There were 4 in 1873. Guido was received by one of the presidents of the ephemeral Spanish Republic, and this one, after asking Guido to sit down, opens his drawer and takes a dagger out of the desk and cries out, I'd rather pierce you with this weapon than give you a peseta. Guido retorts, Excellency, I suppose this hearing is over. At the next hearing, it will be with your successor, and I will resume my mission and I will succeed. As I was producing this talk, I was looking for a picture of Guido as a young man. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find one in my family albums, and equally, Google didn't come up with one either. But what it did find was a reference to Guido that had been posted by a couple who claimed to live in the villa in Paris, which had belonged to Guido in 1876. Well, I got in touch with them right away and they responded immediately. And they asked if I had a picture of Guido from that period. How funny, we were both looking for the same thing. But what they were able to provide was this. A marvellous cartoon of Guido Ellbogen in an 1874 edition of Comic Finance. Guido is depicted as running as fast as his legs can carry him. But what is he running from? And how is it of relevance to a French satirical financial magazine? Well, check the sign just behind Guido's back leg. Can you see the sign that says España? Clearly, he's being depicted as fleeing Spain. Undoubtedly, this is in relation to the story I have just told you about him going to Spain to claim the repayment of the loan owed to France. Banker in speedy retreat is not the best image for an ambitious young man, though this cartoon does, in my view, beautifully capture the image conjured earlier by Rosalie, who said, "Can you imagine Grandpa? Young, cheerful, active, exuberant, dancing breathlessly, making noise like four, and having in his good black eyes this flame of malice and gaiety." You can imagine how delighted I was to receive this fabulous cartoon. And here is an example, again, of amazing timing. And also, as it turned out, the day on which I was carrying out this correspondence was 27th of December, 2020. And guess what? 27th of December was Guido's birthday, 175 years earlier. Do you also recall that Guido had retorted to the President of the Spanish Republic, "Excellency, I suppose this hearing is over. At the next hearing, it will be with your successor, and I will resume my mission and I will succeed." Well, that is exactly what happened. Guido returned and was successful in getting paid in gold what was owed to the bank, and apparently he brought the gold coins back over 1,000 kilometers over the Pyrenees Mountains to Paris in bags on ponies, and to a very grateful bank manager. Now, I have to assure you that the picture that you're seeing is not my grandfather, but I just thought it was rather lovely and might illustrate what we were saying. I will now return to more of the story of my great-grandmother, Ali's letter. You will recall that we left before the break with her having given birth to Antoinette in the middle of the violent chaos of the Paris Commune in 1871. This picture shows Antoinette as a young girl with her younger brother Henri, who would become the Olympic rifler, and little sister Helene, who unfortunately died very young. My own grandmother, Jenny, was not yet born. Ali writes, Guido wanted to return to Austria. That is what he felt he owed his parents, who had made so many sacrifices to give him a proper education, and the greatest by separating from their only child, aged 12, to return to their country when the age would make travel difficult for them. Austria seemed so far away, but I was so in love that I said yes without hesitation. The war, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, had led to heartbreaking horrors in German families, partly fixed at Paris. We saw two brothers in presence of enemy armies. We saw a German son denounce Germans who stayed in Paris. And Guido said to me, I don't want to see my sons act so. When the first one is old enough to go to college at the very latest, we will leave for Austria. I will not raise small renegades. As long as my mother lived, he never spoke of it again. My mother died in January 1878. We returned to Austria with a handsome reward which Guido had received for his successful mission in Spain, and he was able to buy a wonderful country estate, Schloss Talheim, of which I've already told you quite a bit. He bought it in 1881, and Talheim featured very large in the family, and the whole family would come together over the summers. And here is a gathering of cars in 1905. We see at the far right Uncle Henri driving a 1903 Austria Daimler with Grigri or Rosalie at his side, and around them lots of 1905 cars, which I think are rather fabulous. They were also very friendly and hospitable to other people. When I searched for Guido Ellbogen in Google, I came across this book written by Captain Granville Baker, who dedicated his book On the Danube to my good friend Guido Ellbogen. I thought that was rather charming. I've managed to get a copy of the book. And here we see Guido and Ali on their travels in India. Apparently they were pretty adventurous and travelled to many parts of the world. Well, we followed my great-grandparents from falling in love, giving birth in the turmoil of the Commune in Paris, losing Antoinette, their firstborn, at only 30 years old, writing a long and painful letter to Antoinette's 5 children. We've seen Guido, the poor son of a rabbi, succeeding in banking, including his escapades in getting repayment of the Spanish loan in gold, and marrying the younger daughter of his first employer, and then rising to the board of the Anglo-Austrian Bank and making enough money to buy their Schloss, which would be the focus for bringing the wider family together, as well as hosting friends, living life to the full with cars and foreign adventures. Now we turn to tales of Guido and Ali's youngest daughter, Jenny, my grandmother. Guido and Ali had 3 children who survived infancy. Their eldest, Antoinette, as you've heard, died in 1901, aged 30. The next was Henri, the Olympic rifleman, who came back from the war in a very bad state and died in 27. So that left only my grandmother, Jenny Ellbogen, to inherit Schloss Talheim. Jenny married Friedrich Weleminski in December 1905 at Schloss Talheim, and Friedrich was a medical doctor and a researcher in hygiene at the German University of Prague in the medical faculty. It is said of Jenny that biology was one of her passions, and she undoubtedly took a great interest in his work. But she also had other claims to fame. She was an Esperantist and translated books and poems into Esperanto. She was also, like her parents, an avid Habsburg monarchist, and she was an extremely ardent anti-Zionist, while Friedrich, her husband, was an early Zionist. So there was a little bit of conflict in the relationship. Dr. Friedrich Weleminski, from 1900, worked at the German University, and he worked to try and find a treatment for tuberculosis, which at that time killed 1 in 7 people in Europe. He hypothesized that if he cultured TB for many years, it would become weaker and a substance might emerge which could treat TB. The animal of choice to test his theory was the guinea pig. And it was guinea pig number 1769, which was the first to survive. Can you imagine working with that number of guinea pigs? I find it difficult to comprehend. Testing his substance chemically, Weleminski concluded that it was a mucin, so he called the new treatment tuberclomucin Weleminski. After his success with guinea pigs, he decided that the next step would be to test it on cows. Bovine TB was then very common in cows, and indeed it was on his father's model dairy farm at Schloss Talheim. So his next step was to test it on these animals. In 1912, Weleminski published his first report on tuberclomucin. he reported that not only had it worked with cows, but also it was working with humans. And in 1913, there were lots of reports of clinicians who found that it was very successful as a treatment. But in 1914, he was diverted from his research for the war effort, the First World War, and was put in charge of a reserve hospital called Halich, which was stationed in various parts of Austria and Hungary. And while stationed in Kleinreifling, a village in the Upper Austria, he successfully brought a local typhoid epidemic under control, and for which he was made Ehrenbürger, or honorary citizen, of the municipality of Weyer. Over the next 26 years, more than 60 papers were published, most showing positive results for tuberclomucin, and none showing any negative reaction. Tuberclomucin was being promoted on a small scale, as shown in this biopharma advert, and in 1938 he planned to go into commercial production with a pharmaceutical company in Belgium. But with the Anschluss, this fell apart, and Friedrich needed to escape with his wife and his son, my father, to London in 1939. Friedrich and Jenny had 4 children, my father and 3 daughters. This is a family picture from 1926 in Thalheim. The eldest widowed daughter, Marianne Hartstein, and her daughter Charlotte had already escaped to England, although she's shown here with her husband, which is before she had Charlotte. The 2 younger daughters, put on here as Liesel and Dora, they changed their names later, had emigrated in 1935 to Mandate, Palestine, much to their horror of their mother Jenny, who, as I've told you, was vehemently anti-Zionist. So she totally cut them off, while Friedrich, their father, secretly kept in touch with them. Susie Klauser is the 3rd child of Antoinette, and her son Hubert will join the short story I'm telling you shortly. Marianne, a nurse, found work in London in various tuberculosis sanatoria in England, and according to her daughter Charlotte, she continued to culture tuberclomucin in her kitchen and used it to illegally treat patients. She also successfully treated her 16-year-old daughter Charlotte in 1943. As you can see, later, Charlotte qualified as a doctor at the Royal Free Hospital. So Charlotte is the only living person known to have been treated with tuberclomucin. So you might ask the question, how is she faring now? Well, here she is at her 90th birthday celebrations 3 years ago. There is so much more I could tell you about tuberculosis, including the research which I am now involved with, but I don't have time to tell you today. If you're interested, I'm giving a talk about it to the B'nai B'rith Lodge on the 26th of March. If anybody would like the details, please let me know. Turn to the question raised near the beginning of this talk as to how my French cousins, the Adlers, had found my contact details. I had assumed that they had made contact with the owners of Thalheim and that they had given them my details. But it turned out that this was not quite the case. Do you remember me telling you about my sending the Rentmeisters a detailed letter with everything my father could remember? And that when we came for our second visit, that letter was on the wall of one of the family rooms, as they had made it into a mini exhibition. The next time we came, it had gone. Well, why am I telling you this? Let's go back to my opening story about the contact from my French cousins, sending me a booklet about Thalheim. I assumed that they had got my address from the current owners of Thalheim, but it turned out to be different. The granddaughter of one of my French cousins, Hubert, who was working in Vienna when her grandfather visited her, the grandfather was Hubert, she asked him about Thalheim and decided to find the Schloss. And when she arrived, no one was at home. that the building was open. So she wandered around taking pictures, including a picture of my letter on the wall. And that is how they found out about me. The rentmasters, Jörg and Nora, were totally unaware that a stranger had wandered around taking pictures. And that must have been about 7 years before they made contact with me. Quelle chance. Well, we're nearly done, but there's still one more story that I want to pick up on. My cousin Charlotte recently asked me who had stood guarantee for my father when he came to the UK. As I'm sure many of you know, everyone who came was required to have a guarantor who would provide £50 to make sure they would not fall back on the resources of the state. I checked the video that I'd done with my father telling his life story, but he makes no mention of it. And then I remembered that there is an interview with him at the Imperial War Museum as part of the Spielberg collection. And they went into some details about his experiences coming to this country. There he mentions that an English colonel, a friend of his parents, had stood guarantee. He doesn't give his name, but says that he lived in Suffolk, in Beccles. I was totally perplexed. How on earth would my parents know an English colonel who lived in Essex? Who on earth could he be? I'd never heard him mentioned. I wonder if anyone who's paid close attention to his story that I have told you has any idea. Well, do you recall me talking about Captain Granville Baker, who dedicated his book on the Danube to my good friend Guido? Well, that book was written in 1911. But it turns out that during the First World War, he became a lieutenant colonel and went on to live until 1957. Presumably, Friedrich and Jenny maintained friendship which had started with Guido. So I believe that he is likely to be the colonel that my grandfather mentioned. And to seal this conclusion, Wikipedia states that he died in Beccles in Suffolk, which is where my father said he lived. And as you will see, all these stories come back to one place, Schloss Thalheim. So I've given you tales of Spanish gold, guinea pigs, and an English colonel. But I wonder if I have justified the title Austro-Hungarian. Apparently Guido and Ali were very strong Habsburg monarchists. It seems that Jenny inherited this, as it is said of her that she had 3 passions in life, which were biology, Thalheim, and the Imperial Habsburg family. So I will now finish with this story. Apparently a coachman at Thalheim in the 1890s was called up in the army reserves and had to fire a cannon in a display for the emperor. After firing, he took 3 steps backwards, as he was supposed to do, and stepped onto the emperor. He apologized profusely, but the emperor said, no, it was my fault. I shouldn't have been there. So he gave the coachman 2 cigars, and the coachman never smoked them. He proudly showed them to any guests at Thalheim. Thank you, everybody, for listening.